Thank you, Doctora, for the kind introduction. I had the chance to moderate her presentation in Washington, and now she's moderating mine. I didn't set an alarm for hers, though. I also wanted to take the chance to thank the Arab Center for the invitation to a much-needed, thought-provoking forum on the Gulf region. The emergence of the Gulf's rentier economies coincided with the process of state formation that, since their inception, has caused the Gulf states to have certain distributive characteristics. This pathway of development has caused a stickiness of certain institutional arrangements that were crystallized at the critical juncture of the shift from the pre-oil era to the post-oil era. The question that I would like to address today is, how has the strength or weakness of merchant coalitions during the pre-oil era in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar affected the trajectory of institutional development? One critical period that led up to the discovery of oil is the pearl trading era before the 1930s. It set important precedents for development pathways in the Gulf for two reasons. First, the interplay between the merchants and the state placed the development trajectories of critical state institutions. Second, the period of the pearl crash is the best indicator in Gulf history to mirror how a crash would look like for an economy predominantly dependent on one source. In evaluating the three cases, there were three main factors that influenced institutional development. One striking factor is the diversification of trade due to their geostrategic locations in the pre-oil era. The second one is British involvement in domestic politics. And the third is the interplay between revenue extraction apparatuses and main players of revenue producers. The common thread among all three of these variables is the role that the merchants played in the outcome, the trajectory of institutional development. It's important to note, not all merchants were equal. The more dependent the merchants were on pearling, the less power they had in the political economy following the industry's crash. This has significant implications. A factor that distinguished Kuwait from Qatar and Bahrain is that its merchants have historically been and currently remain a stronghold in its politics. This can be partly credited to the fact that Kuwait had a trade economy that was less dependent on the pearling industry. It has a more diversified trade economy than those of Bahrain and Qatar. Hence, the merchants had a more profound influence on domestic politics. Actually, as a result of merchant demands, the social contract of rentierism was formed to hedge against dynastic rule. The merchants of Kuwait benefited from their strategic location for three reasons. Kuwait's port was situated between two main ports, the one of Basra in Iraq and Bushehr in Iran, and the trade route of caravans traveling to and from Aleppo and Baghdad. What is unique about Kuwait's ports is that it was outside the control of the tariff boundaries of the Ottomans. Together, all of these factors set Kuwait being a destination for trade. It connected the merchants to networks throughout the region, consequently giving them an outsized influence relative to their neighbors. In the pre-oil era, the domestic politics of Kuwait remained consultative, largely due to the influence held by the merchants. In the pearling area, the level of consultative relationships did decrease when Mubarak al-Sabah, commonly referred to as Mubarak the Great, consolidated power. Yet the merchants managed to stronghold him to secure favorable policies. To exemplify this, in protest to Sheikh Mubarak's tax policy, the merchants left Bahrain and forced Sheikh Mubarak to personally get them back to return, which is very unique. Although setting up a formal taxation system in Kuwait institutionalized the extraction of money for the government, the merchants were able to set their terms due to their economic power. Their relationship with the sheikhs prompted the state to create institutions, but there were also some that were solely merchant initiated that pushed their interest. For example, they created the Kuwait municipality in 1930, which was actually an elected body led by the merchants and played a role in domestic politics. Another important creation for the merchants was the education system, which they actually in the early 1900s, education just focused mainly on religious studies. And the merchants decided to create and expand the curriculum. Therefore, they raised funds privately and established the first official school in Kuwait, which was in 1912. It's in Barkia School. It was actually strategically named after Sheikh Mubarak, but really controlled by the merchants. They also established an education council to supervise and develop the school system. And they did the same for the health system as well. Through these institutions, the merchants of Kuwait lobbied their interest, a movement that was significant in setting a precedent for institutional development across the Gulf was the 1938 movement coined as the Majlis movement. The emergence of this movement across the Gulf has been portrayed as a reaction to the merchants' fear of losing influence in the wake of the discovery of oil in 1938. Upon this realization, the merchants made their demands, arguing that revenues from oil should be earmarked for development rather than wastefully becoming income for just the sheikhs. The concept of rentierism and existing social contract emerges here. I believe this is a critical juncture for the establishment of the existing social contract. In the 1938 movement, the merchants organized politically through the very institutions that they helped to establish. They leveraged their newly established Education Council and the Kuwait municipality to push for a legislative assembly. They were able to establish a short-lived majlis that quickly fell apart due to the sudden shifting alliances with the British from the merchants to the sheikhs. During the 1938 movement, originally, the merchants managed to ally themselves with both the British and the local dissidents, isolating the rulers and initiating elections for a majlis. Majlis is like a legislative body, just to translate. However, the 1938 National Assembly was short-lived as the British withdrew their support and the sheikhs got together and consolidated their power into a dynastic monarchy and closed the Majlis in 1939. This was incredibly important in the political moment of Kuwait because you see the shift to a dynastic rule where the family tried to hold on the different institutions of power. And arguably, I think this influenced the whole Gulf region, in my humble opinion. Also, it is important to highlight one key dissident that allied himself with the merchants was Sheikh Abdullah Salim, who later in 1950 became the emir and under his rule established the first National Assembly in 1963, which is in existence today. Meanwhile, the merchants' changes implemented in the window of opportunity that occurred at the forefront of oil's discovery cannot be ignored. They set a precedent by creating the first Kuwaiti political bloc, the National Bloc. Today, there are many different blocs in Kuwaiti politics, as you know. The bloc restructured the tax system, introduced public health regulations, opened schools, reformed the judicial system, and began building the modern Kuwait. Kuwait politics has never been the same since then. As for Bahrain, of all the Gulf ports, Bahrain had the most important and active pearl trading port in the pre-oil era. This allowed the pearl trading merchants to be a powerful segment within Bahraini society. The tribal merchants, mainly in the pearling industry, held power and at times even challenged the states. They had great autonomy and established vertical integration of the industry, including insourcing security. While the urban merchants were highly susceptible to the state and its decisions, that relationship actually flipped later. The same element that gave the tribal merchants their strength also proved to be their greatest weakness. In the 1930s, the pearl industry crashed and they quickly fell out of power. Amidst the implosion of the pearl industry, the urban merchants, many of whom were pearl traders, but also landlords and money lenders, were able to weather the transition due to their more diverse income sources. Although the urban merchants, unlike the tribal ones, were not as autonomous and were unable to evade taxation, through the payments of taxation, they became more empowered. They found opportunities in state-created institutions to lobby their interests. The change in this economic context caused a redistribution of power and allowed for the expansion of bureaucratic apparatuses. Like Kuwait, to a certain degree, through state institutions such as the municipal councils, the merchants of Bahrain contested power. In this context, the urban merchants obtained control of the municipal council and were able to increase their influence. The council allowed for the merchants to protect their investments and hedge themselves against the harsh economic climate of the 1930s. The Majlis movement, which spread from Kuwait, had a domino effect across the Gulf and was adopted by the urban merchants in Bahrain. It was through this movement that the merchants lobbied for the creation of a council of elites, which again is like a legislative body, in order to increase their influence on the state. However, in the end, the Bahraini merchants were not able to establish their legislative assembly until 1973, which got dissolved in 1975, and then was reinstituted in 2002. Similar to Kuwait, but to a greater extent, one factor that caused Bahrain's failure to create a consultative majlis from the other Gulf states was the heightened British involvement in the island's internal politics. Charles Belgrave, a political agent of the British, had a direct hand in shaping state leadership and the development of Bahraini institutions. He saw it against the British's interest to allow the creation of any entity that would be equivalent to a parliament. Arguably, had it not been for the British, it is highly likely that Bahrain's National Assembly would have been first founded in the 1930s. The case of Qatar differed from Kuwait and Bahrain in that there was very little diversification from the pearling industry. This had a domino effect on the economy's institutional development in the pre and post eras. The location of Qatar lacked the strategic advantages of Bahrain and Kuwait, and due to that, there was actually, the merchants never really developed a strong coalition. Additionally, there were other factors that affected them, like in 1783, some of the main merchants left to Bahrain for political reasons. Also, unlike Bahrain, Qatar didn't have a debt system where the pearl divers were in debt to the merchants, so the merchants didn't have that level of power and leverage. Another distinction when compared to the other two countries is the revenues. The government revenues were rooted in the pearl industry with less emphasis as the merchants as brokers. In this context, the merchants had lower bargaining power and they were greatly weakened. And there was actually no Majlis movement in Qatar, which ironically, it didn't happen in Qatar, but it did happen in Kuwait and Bahrain. The fact that the merchants were unable to create a bloc to negotiate with the rulers and that the leadership did not consolidate power through a taxation mechanism that could independently support the government meant that Qatar could make little progress in institutional development prior to the discovery of oil. And it's interesting to note that the British didn't have a strong involvement in Qatar until 1950, and that's when the institutional development process happened. Today, not only is the social contract affected by the relationships sealed on the eve of oil, but also the institutions that affect the trajectory of private sector development. The existence of a strong merchant class in the pre-oil era had grave implications for economic development trajectories. Today, Kuwait's merchants are strong and control a large part of the private sector, even though I believe the government is still stronger. Qatar, on the other hand, has a government enterprise-based economy, whereas Bahrain is on the brink of reaching its status after the pearl industry crash, where the autonomous pearl merchants were facing the same challenge as the Bahraini government today as resources are running out. I know they discovered oil, but that hasn't come into fruition yet. Okay, the Bahraini government dependent on oil wealth has now turned to the business elite. And actually, if you look at the Chamber of Commerce now, the business elite, they actually competed very viciously to get those seats because they know that it's their turn. In the pre-oil era, Kuwait had the most diversified economy and Qatar the least, while Bahrain was in the middle. It is indisputable that their geostrategic location was a defining factor correlating with their respective levels of trade diversification. Similar to their level of diversification, there was an identical trend in the merchants' level of power as a political bloc. Another striking relationship appears when you evaluate these parliaments, which are vital institutions for legislation on economic development, with the level of power they have relative to the level of power the merchants held in the pre-oil era. There is a clear trend in how the consultative relationship is driven by merchants reflects in their respective legislative bodies. Kuwait's merchants were on the forefront of creating institutions critical to state formation. I'm almost done. Before the discovery of oil, such as establishing an education system, healthcare, and distributive apparatuses. Yet commonly, it is identified that Kuwait's current state is also receding in its institutional development. Today, it is evident that the merchants have a heavier hand in private sector development in Kuwait, while in Qatar, their development is more dependent on government enterprise, which is arguably more efficient in the case of Gulf economies. I'm going to go to my concluding points. In conclusion, dissecting all of this, there are key trends that can be derived here about how merchants set precedents for existing institutions. Where merchants exited, a different political economy emerged. That is reflected today, also evidenced in the legislative bodies. The merchant demands for oil wealth to be shared with the population set precedents for the social contract of today's Gulf frontier economies. The reaction of the interplay between the merchant and the government led to the establishment of dynastic leadership across the Gulf. And the Pearl Crash era offers critical insights with regards to the importance of economic diversification and the interplay of key players in the post-oil era. Thank you.
Thank you, Dania, for a very informative presentation.